Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. The band is together again. We have reunited for our world tour. Anyway, it's just us, the Pugcast guys. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor and I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, and I've written stuff. Enough about me. How about you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics, a few other things at Gordon Conwell and a few other places.
Glenn
Sunshine, retired history professor, senior fellow at Colson Center for Christian Worldview, work for Reflections Ministries as well, and I've got my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries. More about that on a future program.
Okay. Well, it's my show today, and I'd like to talk about something that maybe longtime listeners to the podcast will be familiar with, and that is something I'm drawing from Matthew B. Crawford and his book, Shop Class as Soulcraft. I was recently approached by a publisher and asked to submit a proposal for a kind of Christian version of this book. In many ways, this book is already a Christian book, and since he wrote the book, Crawford has become a Christian. When he wrote the book originally, I think he was just kind of an interesting sort of independent thinker and a guy who was coming out of a background that's a little similar to mine. He grew up in Berkeley, California. I think his parents taught at Berkeley, and he grew up in a commune. And he, like teenagers do, revolted. But the problem is when your parents are already hippies or extreme left wingers, how do you do that? And the way he did it was he subscribed to Soldier of Fortune magazine and became an auto mechanic and electrician. So now he did go on to get his PhD in political philosophy from the University of Chicago, which isn't too shabby. They went on to help establish a center at the University of Virginia. Maybe he didn't help to establish it, but he was at the University of Virginia for a while. And while he was there, he actually opened up a motorcycle repair shop. So this is an interesting guy to me because he straddles the divide between working with your hands, doing blue-collar things, and thinking deeply about what he's doing. We've talked about this, a number of times. A lot of the blue-collar guys out there have good horse sense, good common sense, but they're not terribly well-read. And then there are a lot of people who appear to be well-read, but are just kind of dolts when it comes just to the art of living. And Crawford fascinated me because of his, like I said, his ability to span the divide. But one of the things he does in this book, and I'd like to explore this theme a little bit with you, is he talks about an important distinction between agency and autonomy. Agency and autonomy. So to paraphrase, autonomy is really illusory because we all depend on many things to live. And we are part of a social milieu in which we rely on other people to do what they promise and help us. And in exchange, we do things for them. And this is what we call an economy. And so consequently, there is a sense in which we're already embedded in the world of obligations. So autonomy is never absolute. It's not as though we're in a nil space like God before the creation of the world, bringing things into being out of nothing. But we're seduced into thinking that's the case. And what we find ourselves presented with are sort of pre-packaged choices, and then we're told to choose. And then this gives us the illusion of autonomy. Yeah. We're given these choices. It's sort of like when my kids were small, and they didn't want to eat their broccoli, and I'd say to them, "You have a choice: eat your broccoli or stand in the corner." Eat your broccoli or time out. And this gave them the illusion that they actually we're in charge.
Yeah.
I can stand in the corner. I can eat my broccoli. Anyway, that's kind of what the world does to us. It presents us with a series of choices. You can choose a Snickers bar or a Baby Ruth. But on the other hand, contrasted with this is agency. And agency is paradoxical, but in a different way. If we say autonomy is paradoxical in the sense that it creates the illusion that we're in charge in a fundamental sense, we may be in charge of that particular choice, whether we're going to watch NBC or ABC. But the networks have already established, the conditions for us to sort of participate in. So we're not really autonomous in the absolute sense, but in a relative sense. In contrast, agency presents us with a set of really things we have to submit to in order to exercise agency. Let me give you an example. So, as folks in Pugcast land might know, I've been a landlord since 1994. I've probably had 80 plus tenants over the years. I've had lots of experience with managing buildings and maintaining them and working with people and so forth. And when I describe to people the benefits of being a landlord or a landlady, it's inevitable that the people who are looking for kind of the downside will respond, well, I don't want to be called at 3 a.m. to be told that the toilet's not working and have to go over there and unclog it for my tenant. Now, I've been a landlord, going on, 30 plus years. I've never had that call. In fact, I've got, a list of subcontractors that I turn to whenever people do have a problem. So, for example, I had to have a water heater installed in one of the units that I have. But that obviously cost me money. But what we're dealing with then is this sort of trade-off between having a set of obligations, and because you have real agency when you willingly take on those obligations, you don't have the kind of autonomy that you're seduced by with this other set of choices that are often presented to you. So I'm actually in Connecticut this week because of certain things I needed to address with regard to the properties that I own. A couple of legal matters, a particular project that needed to be undertaken. But because I've shouldered those obligations, I have a kind of agency, not only with the properties that I own, but also just kind of generally in life, that people who shirk this kind of responsibility don't possess. And I guess that's what I'm getting at, is this, do we want to be people who are capable, knowledgeable, really exercising agency, or do we want to just kind of keep our options open and have this illusion that we're free when in fact we're not as free as we might think we are? But anyway, that's sort of the thing to consider, and I'd like just to throw it out there for you guys to react to.
I just started teaching back on campus this term, 5 days a week, which is, it's been nice. But one of the things you always notice at the beginning of the school year are dress trends, clothing trends. And what is interesting is always that almost every one of those students would say they're being kind of original and being trendy but original, having their own take, but they're all wearing the exact same selection. They were free to pick it in some sense of the word, right? They could have went somewhere else, but in a sense, they're caught up in this notion that this is them following a trend and free to follow it. But on the other hand, they're really just going along with a pre-written script by a lot of writers that have led to that moment. And I think that gets a lot at this notion of freedom and autonomy is basically things coming from what I really like or what I like at that moment, or not conditioned by many other things than what I prefer. And they don't realize that their whole preference and their whole preferring have already been shaped and determined in so many ways that they, again, are enacting a script, and they aren't even really enacting an agency so much as is going with the flow. Whereas participation in, the proper determinations of reality, if you'll put it that way, like you said, submitting to the kind of things that are real and we have no way of escaping. There's a way you can do that. And there's a way that when as theologians will say, that true agency, Aquinas, for example, true agency or true freedom is the truthful enactment of your creatureliness. So that means to truly be able to unfold the kind of creature you are, which means as a creature, you're determined in many ways. But you do have a real freedom that partakes of that freedom. So on one hand, there's a pathos, if you will, there's an undergoing of reality that determines us. But on the other side, when we accord or relate to it, go with its proper directing and leading, we actually are a real agent within that set of determinations and really have a part to play. And it is a mystery, but this is why those things that hinder us from being able to truly receive things and be shaped by them and orient ourselves the right way to them hinders our freedom, and we become ensnared.
Yeah, I was at the mall, the Manchester Mall. You guys know that mall. Last night, and I just took my daughter and her husband and one of my granddaughters out to dinner, and so they went home, and I just thought, hey, I want to check this place out. I haven't been here in a long time.
Yeah.
And it all had been kind of upgraded and renovated, and it was all very nice. There weren't nearly as many people in it as
that's true.
I think malls are in trouble. But I couldn't help but have this impression that you had, Tom.
Yeah.
Store after store had the exact same stuff.
Yeah.
It was all sort of like this hip hop, trendy, name brandish stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure that if we were to go back in time and look at the malls that we frequented as teenagers, we'd see this something similar. But I don't know, because I'm older, I have a kind of distance that I didn't have then, and it all just struck me as homogenous.
At least we could get purple corduroy bell bottom.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I don't want to cast too many aspersions on kids today, as the saying goes, because I'm sure that in fact, I can remember older people complaining about my generation.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Well, I remember being in college, and one of my roommates always wore a long sleeve 7-button shirt and dress pants every day. And he actually buttoned it all the way up to the top, because he said, if I got a button, I should be using it. And he commented, that everybody out there is, saying they want to dress as an individual, but they're all wearing blue jeans and t-shirts.
Right.
It was the student uniform. I actually used to call it that, the student uniform.
Right.
And then I remember when Madonna came out, you had this whole thing of Madonna wannabes.
Right.
And I saw an interview where somebody was asking them why they were, why are you dressing like this? And her answer was, it's to express my individuality.
That's right. Yeah.
This is not a new phenomenon.
But it raises a very fascinating point. But compared to what they're usually kind of reacting against, the kind of, like, for example, the private school where you have school uniforms, like you were mentioning, or the public school in UK where you have school uniforms, or I remember even in communist countries, you had to break down this kind of psychology of the haves and the have-nots, or that you would do have this uniformity. But on the flip side, you have this running uniformity. It just comes under the fact that, if you've come at it a different way, it hasn't been initiated by the school, it's been initiated by the market or whatever. But you've still definitely, and the more global it gets, of course, the more removed from any kind of locale it gets, it starts to become even more bland, because it's not just local or within your own country, but it becomes almost everywhere.
Do you guys remember that cartoon, The Far Side?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That was great. Younger people aren't familiar with it, but I remember, it was a single panel, and this guy, is it Gary Larson?
Yes.
Yeah.
So he was brilliant, and he had a kind of sort of angle of vision that was remarkably insightful. But I remember this one where there was a sea of penguins. It's just like, less like penguins as far as you can see. And there was one in the middle who had raised himself above the crowd and was singing, I think I did it my way, or maybe I gotta be me. I gotta be me.
It's gotta be me. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, I ran into a Calvin and Hobbes. This was one of my favorites. I ran into a Calvin and Hobbes where he was talking about the difficulty of protesting. And his parents' generation, and so what he did is he bought an album of Muzak, and when Hobbes was questioning about this, he said, "Yeah, I like to play it real quietly." This was Calvin's, But here's the thing that strikes me about autonomy, and this I think is what Crawford was getting to. It's fundamentally a lie.
Right.
Because I can think of nothing more horrifying, or very few things more horrifying, than the idea of absolute autonomy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Because what that does is it says if you're genuinely an autonomous being in the absolute sense of the word, it cuts you off from family, it cuts you off from culture, it cuts you off from everything.
Right.
And it's like this idea that you have to define yourself without regard to a tradition, without regard to family, without regard to any externals. You've just got to define yourself in terms of yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is what's promoted in a lot of the LGBTQ stuff.
Right.
But that is autonomy brought to its logical end, except it's impossible.
Yeah.
And if it were possible, it would be horrifying.
Yeah, and I think it does make you more vulnerable and malleable to sinister forces. I mean, that's the point of it, because if you don't have you tell people they have some kind of self that is somehow self-identifiable, but you have no reference point other than something that is so thin, it's almost the equivalent of nothing. There's no essence there, to where philosophers and postmodernists will say you have no real essence, right? You have no real nature or self. Your self is just based on certain kinds of relations that are determined for you. And the key is just to get them determined the right way, so you're not determined by those sets of conditions, really. And so they're already working with a delusion. Any kind of autonomy is bad. But the flip side is the Enlightenment desire to be freed from bad types of determination, right? Those that crush everything sometimes about one, has led to this kind of mess where they want to get rid of anything that doesn't accord with what I want to be limited by. So if a family and family obligations aren't something that I want to bother me, I can just brush it off and build trivial relationships based on my passions or likes. But you do this enough and you create a society like this, that's why you get the cesspool that has created the very conditions of problems, especially psychological problems. Because when you don't have these gifts of relations and families and supports and communities and certain kinds of shared cultural mores and obligations and values in the right way, you're on your own, and that's a bad place to be, as you just said.
Yeah.
Well, and actually, that is the thing that explains social contagions. We've got massive amounts of social contagions taking place right now, particularly around the transgender thing. If you tell people you are not defined by anything, it makes you susceptible to other people telling you stuff that you can then start to believe.
Yeah.
And this is where social contagions come from.
Yeah, I think there are a couple things that are worth also kind of bringing up at this point. One is that genuinely creative people, architects, visual artists, sculptors, whatever, they work with a set of constraints. In fact, I remember talking to an architect once, and he said, the worst possible situation you can find yourself in as an architect is just a flat lot.
Build something.
Yeah, it's almost like there are too many options. And so what makes for interesting building or architecture is a set of constraints. There's something about the neighborhood. There's something about the terrain. There's something about just the needs of the people who are there, paying for the structure. So there are all these things that force you as an architect to think about, what you're doing within a framework, and then that actually is conducive to kind of generative thinking, genuine creativity.
Yeah.
One of the examples I like to give, related to this, and maybe I've brought this up before, is beer commercials. You're not allowed in American television to show someone drinking a beer in a beer commercial. Like I remember seeing some commercials from the 50s before this rule was established, and there'd be this guy, and he would pick up a beer and drink it and say, that was good. Now, I mean, it was the 1950s and the commercials were pretty hokey. But when this rule was established, I don't know why it was established. Maybe they just thought social contagion. If people saw people drinking beer on television, they'd all just run out and just get drunk. I don't know. But anyway, what it forced beer sellers, brewers to do is get really creative. That's why we had all these hilarious campaigns for beer. Now, beer, of course, is a fun thing, and so it lends itself to that kind of irreverent, fun, sort of laughter-filled kind of commercial. But think about it. That's if you can't show somebody enjoying a beer, you have to kind of create an environment in which beer kind of is like the obvious kind of go-to.
Yeah.
One of my books, The Reformation for Armchair Theologians, had cartoons in it. And the cartoonist for the Marburg Colloquy, which is a debate between Luther and Zwingli over the nature of Christ's presence in the elements of the Lord's Supper, he had the two of them at a table arguing, and the caption was, "Tastes great, less filling."
Right.
Some of our audience won't know that reference, but anyway. Two things that occur to me. First of all, this is going right back to the thing that I talk about all the time when I'm doing political theology: the difference between liberty and license.
Yeah.
That liberty is the freedom to act within certain constraints, traditionally constraints dictated by divine and natural law, whereas license is freedom from all constraints. And everybody argues, the classical political theorists argue that liberty is a natural right, but nobody has a right to license.
Right.
And yet what we're seeing, I've argued politically, what we've done is we've redefined the word freedom away from liberty toward license.
Yeah. Right.
But we're talking about the same thing here when it comes to agency versus autonomy.
Right.
The other thing, Tom, this is one for you. One of the effects of the Enlightenment that is underestimated is the alphabeticization of knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, so epistemologically, knowledge was always organized categorically in a structure, so that you would understand that you need geometry before astronomy.
Yeah, that's right.
Because and ultimately theology is the queen of the sciences. It's the one that integrates all of the others. Well, the Enlightenment comes along, and this is coming out of Locke's psychology that says we're born as blank slates. They don't want to impose an external structure on people. They want them to be able to develop their own ideas from their own experiences and things like that. So how do you how do you teach? How do you communicate information? Well, we can't do it using the traditional structures and traditional system of organization. So what are we going to do? Rather than organizing our encyclopedias around topics and themes and how they interrelate, we'll just stick things in alphabetical order.
Yeah, that's it.
Yes.
And so that people can encounter them in their own way and pursue them in their own way so that they can develop their own unique, unconstrained structures in their mind.
Yeah.
So, that is actually a major change in the way we think of knowledge and the way we organize and communicate
and
knowledge.
it explains why you have that shift even in the arena of conceptions of liberty and freedom. Because again, with theology as the queen, I mean, think of Augustine's Confessions, right? It's not Rousseau's, right? And it's not anything that comes by the telling of your own story now. It's all already talking about the ultimate determination, which is the ground of your own existence and any kind of freedom, God. And secondly, it starts with from his infancy, the familial relation determination, and then the embodied and material. All these types of things that go and precede our being a human person and having an agency. And then it is from within that the rest of it comes in. And that is a much fuller and more true to reality picture than Locke's notion that we're some kind of blank slate. We've got a lot of premise going on, not a blankness.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, one of the things about just even the alphabetization of knowledge is that in it is also a structure. So how many people, for example, when you think about the chronology, somebody says, I'm going to read the encyclopedia, and they get to D and then stop because they're just exhausted. and that's the end of it. So what ends up happening is that there's a kind of preference for A, B, and C. In other words, just in practice, people don't ever get to, unless they already know what they want to inquire about and then go to that part of it. But if you're thinking about how things get structured in terms of a sequence, the front part of the sequence or the beginning of the sequence is always where the most attention is given. So, and then you're like, well, do you really want A, B, and C to be like the things that everybody knows about and nobody knows about X or W? Or
you have to start at the back of the book. Isn't that the postmodernists, right? Start at the back of the book and read it the other way.
Right. Now I want to switch. I want to kind of switch the focus to agency for a moment. There's this marvelous statement that Crawford makes in the book. So essentially, the point that Crawford is advancing in the book is that it's through a disciplined submission to a kind of physical task that you actually grow in competence and agency. So in the physical world. So you don't become a good roofer by reading a book on roofing, in other words, and kind of conceptually understanding how roofing works. You actually have to get up on the roof and lay shingles and so forth. So that's his point, and he's making a very, I think, strong case for the goodness of the physical world when he talks about this.
Yeah.
But there's a paradox, and he says the paradox in our experience of agency is this: to be master of your own stuff. In other words, the physical things that surround you. You have to be mastered by them.
Yeah.
So this is, to get back to the example of working with your hands. So a craftsman, in order to be good at working with stone or good with working with wood or whatever, needs to, on the one hand, use the tools that need to be employed to work with those materials, but then also has to grow in a sort of intuitive understanding, kind of an experiential sort of way, the materials that he's working with. So as a guy that was, working in framing, I can tell you that there's a dramatic difference between working with, say, yellow pine that's been pressure treated and redwood. Even a more dramatic difference between, say, cedar and redwood. Cedar is perhaps the most forgiving wood you can possibly work with. It's sort of like the ultimate in terms of wood to work with because it smells great. It cuts like butter.
Yeah.
And it's easy to work with. It's very forgiving.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, the girl that's a 10.
Yeah.
In every way. She's just got a great personality. She looks great, everything. Redwood is very unforgiving. Yeah. This is like the severe, beauty who has just got no patience for anyone who doesn't know how to interact with her in the way that she wants. Redwood is going to have it on her own terms. But so when you work with those woods, then you kind of learn how to work with them, and then as you work with them, you become the master of those woods by submitting to their intrinsic characteristics. That's the paradox.
Yeah, this is very much in accord with classic ways Christians and some even ancient, philosophers understood participation, right? By participate, they may have had, like pagan philosophies may have had a depreciation of the material, but with Christianity, you're connected to everything in intimate ways, and the creation is a good, and it's a gift, and that gift comes to you with its own kinds and characters and purposes and potential. And part of our being given the task of dominion in the right sense of the word is this kind of husbandry that goes along with it, allowing that potential to develop in accord with the plenteous ways in which it can be for a whole variety of things that are kind of intrinsically in it that you haven't been brought out. And so instead of kind of this Baconian notion of trying to understand that word almost as a master of it, that you can exploit all of that, there is a sense of relational submission, just like old knowledge. Classic views of knowledge is the thing I'm learning about. In a way, it's participating in me and I'm participating in it. And when we participate in accord with it, knowledge is birthed, right? Think of the biblical word for knowing. I mean, how intimate can knowledge get? And I think knowing creaturely things, material things, has analogous things about it. Yeah. It's that kind of closeness that you have to have where you respect and kind of give yourself over to their shape, form, and purposes. And from that, you can bring about all kinds of amazing things.
Yeah. The example I want to go to is Michelangelo, who argued that stones have statues in them that you need to free.
Now, with that point, real quick, is Crawford's next point is just as, and I think this is what you were saying, Chris, just as Glenn's point was made, it is also the flip side. That marble and that stone has fashioned and formed your soul.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a kind of, I think the starting point is humility. So knowledge, genuine knowledge in the way we're talking about, the precondition is to admit you don't know anything. This, of course, is the classic Socratic paradox, when the Oracle at Delphi said Socrates was the wisest man in Greece, and his response was, well, that's because I know I don't know anything.
But with like Glenn's point, the pulling out of, the marble, in a sense, that marble is also pulling that out of working with it is the pulling of it out of us. Is that where you go?
Right. Interesting thing, the David, Michelangelo's David, other people had tried to work with that chunk of marble, but they couldn't get anything out of it because it had a flaw in it. It had a significant crack. And Michelangelo worked with the crack to produce David.
That's great. That's great.
I mean, it's, the story is just kind of amazing. But again, the material dictated what he could do with it. Right. But there's a there's a feedback. Not the feedback isn't the right word. There's sort of an interplay between the artist and the material
Right.
that produces what you get. And if you lose mastery on either end of that, you don't get the David. You don't get art.
Well, this brings us back to the paradox. So mastery begins with humility and submission. It also means dramatically reducing the range of your choices. So a lot of guys just never grow up because they're afraid of what they're going to miss out on. So it's like the guy who's watching television and he can't settle on a show and he just flips from channel to channel. Now he gets picture in picture and then picture in picture and picture in picture. So then he feels like he's not missing anything, but he's not actually attending to anything either. He's just sort of flitting back and forth and getting just kind of little sound bites from everything and not actually really being drawn into anything. And this is at least it used to be. I don't know if I hear it as much today, but it was a complaint that many women had when it came to men who just couldn't commit. You remember those days when the guy would just date and never want to take the next step, and the woman was looking for a commitment. I think understandably and justifiably so. But this guy just doesn't want to grow up. That's the term playboy. When you think about the original sort of understanding, when you hear the term playboy, obviously the publication comes to mind. But the other thing that comes to mind is a guy who is a boy. He hasn't grown up and he just wants to play. Yeah. So on the one hand, we use that to sort of denote somebody who's a player, a guy who's like got a lot of women and has many sort of trysts and lots of experience, but never really gets to a place where he's admirable, except in maybe a kind of debased way. He knows how to get what he wants, but no one really depends on him for anything.
Yeah, well, you tend to see this again with, unbelievers who get extremely and excruciatingly wealthy, and then when you would think here is someone who has all the quote unquote freedom that money can buy, they have the ugliest, most plastically reconstructed woman by their side on a yacht, just chunked in partying all the time, and there's nothing about it from, I think, a soul of substance that sees that as if you had all of that resources, that's what you would be spending your spare time in, your freedom.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's also the problem of the second generation too. Yeah. That frequently the first generation people get there because they're hard workers, they're creative, they're energetic, they're focused, they're dedicated, and all of that. Then they pass it on to their kids, who don't have the same, unless they've been raised really right, they don't have the same vision, they don't have the same work ethic, they don't, they're just going to live off the fruit of what they've got.
Yeah, which I think is really a worthwhile thing to kind of ponder for a moment. How do you go about bringing a child along? So, in the case of the first generation, here's a person who's kind of learning as sort of like going along. In other words, it's not as though this is a structured environment that he finds himself in. He's making it up. It's like the old adage, we're building this wagon while we ride it. So in some ways he's not self-made, but in other ways he is. And then you have the challenge, okay, here's a kid who's in a very different setting than the father. The father maybe was an orphan, or maybe the father was kicked out of the house, or maybe the father was the ne'er-do-well who made well, that kind of thing. And he makes something of himself from scratch. But it's that scratching and clawing and sort of experimenting that made him who he is. Wise, prudent, able to take risks, good on his feet, thinks quick, knows how to interact with a wide range of people. And now you get the kid. And the trouble is that he's just in a very different place existentially. And now the task of the father is to manufacture stressors, sort of put him in settings where he can fail. But there's always the kind of the assurance in the back of the mind that Dad will bail me out.
Yeah.
Dad didn't have that assurance.
Yeah.
He was just making it up as he went. So it's a challenge. I mean, and I'm not sure that you can ever get past it. I've known young people who've grown up really well and have been and are admirable, who grew up the children of self-made men. So it's not impossible, but it's just different. It's just different.
Yeah. I know people who are very wealthy, and what they did is they set up generation skipping trusts.
Yeah.
So their kids don't inherit. They provide for their grandkids, but the kids don't inherit. The kids are going to have to find their own way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll help them start businesses or things like that, but they're going to have to do it. So that's one way of approaching it.
Yeah.
The other is start the kid in the mailroom.
That's right. Well, but in both situations, now I think those are good things to do. I'm not trying to say they're not, but at the same time, the kid always kind of knows,
Nothing's foolproof.
Yeah. And anyway, it just kind of is what it is, and that's the challenge of sort of intergenerational. It's the problem with dynasties. Dynasties, when they're successful, help to create conditions, and this is as old as the stories we read in the Bible. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The old adage. I have seen households that have been successful over several generations.
Yeah.
And often I think it has to do with the wisdom of the patriarch. How he interacts with his children is huge in all that. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is very rare historically for great kings to be followed by great successors.
Yeah.
You have some examples of it, Philip of Macedon and Alexander. My favorite example is 3 generations, Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, and Charlemagne. But things start falling apart pretty close after that.
Yeah.
But these kinds of things don't happen that often.
Yeah. Anyway, returning to the theme, autonomy versus agency, one of the things that Crawford commiserates about in the book is that we have a world that extols autonomy and creates the illusion of autonomy, and it's sort of that's kind of the way the economy is structured or set up, is to create this ongoing sort of virtual reality that we live in, where we're led to believe that we're autonomous, but in fact the choices are all between Universal Studios and Disney World. I mean, those are the choices. Maybe but the world of sort of the self-made, the people who exercise genuine agency. Here's the trick: you can't package that, and that's why we don't see much of it, sort of advertised. How do you make money off of people doing things for themselves? Right?
That's right. Yeah, that's why they get you quickly. That's the goal, is to get. I mean, governments do it as well.
Yeah. Right.
What is it Paul Tyson says in one of his books is there's nothing more difficult to solve than a puzzle that in reality, kind of a philosophical puzzle and problem that in reality isn't one. So it's the way they keep fostering types of ill-defined racism, right? And they move to the structures, and they move to the
right. Yeah, it's kind of a shell game. But I guess the thing is how do we go about the task of encouraging young people to do the hard thing? Now, it does happen. I mean, I have been inspired by the examples of other people. I have been inspired by even books that I've read that became very popular and were widely read. But there is this sort of, even when you have that kind of literature out there that is encouraging people to take the plunge, there's still a small minority of people who do it, and a vast majority. Like if you think about, say, this book, Shop Class of Soul, it was a bestseller. So how many people actually did anything about it? Probably a tiny fraction.
Yeah.
Now, I'm glad that some people did. This reminds me, when I was involved in real estate, I was also, I've owned real estate over, for a long time, but I've also helped other people acquire it and sell it. And I remember a number of experiences where I would have a young couple who expressed interest in becoming property owners, sort of investment real estate property owners. Renting out, say, multifamilies or commercial properties or whatever. And there would be this kind of deer in the headlights moment where they had to make a choice. Okay, I would show them a number of properties. I'd help them evaluate the properties. And then there would be this moment of truth where I was like, okay, are you going to do it? And most of the time, they couldn't bring themselves to do it. They would just freeze. And then they would get in touch with me years later and tell me I wish I had done it.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting thing to sort of ponder. What is it? So let's just think about education. So you both of you guys did the deed of getting the PhD. Yeah. There was a point. Now that's a small minority when it comes to, we all have to go to school.
Yeah.
Right. And then when we get to the end of compulsory schooling, then we, go on, some people do, go on for a college degree and get a bachelor's or an associate's or whatever. Then there is a smaller group of masochists who go on for the master's degree. And then there are the people who really do flagellate themselves, who go on for the PhD. Now,
I still have scars.
I'm having a little fun.
Oxford stuff, man.
I'm having a little fun. But let's just think.
These medieval universities.
But let's just think about that. So there are people who do the deed. Who take the step, who do the thing that a lot of people maybe say they wish they had done but didn't do.
Yeah.
Like in your cases, what was it that made you cross the line and say, I'm going to do that?
Well, in my case, it was rather simple. I'm not. Well, I was working when I got out of my undergrad. I was working as a tech writer while I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I concluded that I liked teaching and writing, but I wasn't overly interested in technology. I was more interested in people and ideas and stuff. And I knew in high school that if I was ever going to teach, it would have to be at a college level. So getting a PhD was a union card.
Okay. Why was it necessary for you to teach at the college level? You could have been a high school teacher.
I knew when I was in high school that if I was going to teach, it would be college level. I had a hard enough time dealing with high school students when I was young.
So this was in terms of the way you described it, it was like the easiest choice.
Yeah.
Yep.
How about you, Tom?
Yeah, for me, that's how it was.
For me, I think it was a little different. I did an undergrad in music, and I taught guitar 18 years, and so all the while continuing to explore other things. I had a lot of questions. They were existential questions, and I wasn't satisfied first with what the bachelors were giving me. And then as I started to really see that you can study theology and the kind of higher ways of reflecting on these things, I started that path, and really opportunities started to open up that, kind of don't always show up for everyone. And I worked very hard on my end, but they also opened up. And so, and the joy of learning, I love to learn. I am definitely not, the one thing, it's not new to anyone who studies is the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know anything and you have to keep going. And so I just had a good advantage to study under some great people who really led me in directions that I'm glad they did lead me to. And they put an emphasis on things. But it wasn't, I don't think it was pragmatic. And again, not everyone, I don't make that as advice for anyone. But finally, you said, you know what, I love this material and this enough to go where it leads.
So I think that teaching is a kind of craft.
Yeah.
It's not something that anyone can do. There are certain skills that you develop as you do it. Now, you can have a kind of a natural aptitude.
Yeah.
But I also think that even those who have a natural aptitude can refine their skills, grow masterful, in the craft. So there was a genuine interest in the material.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important feature to this.
Yeah.
Like getting back to my illustration concerning real estate and sort of commercial real estate, I had a real desire to own income-producing real estate. And I think in part it had to do with my childhood and being awarded the state and living in sort of, public housing and stuff like that. It was a world that was sort of kind of attractive to me because it was so much a kind of a departure from what I had known. So I was kind of drawn into it. It wasn't just an abstraction for me. It wasn't like, oh, this is a great way to make money, or this is a good thing to do. It was more like there was something kind of in the chemistry, my own personal chemistry, that had to do with the sort of the conditions of my childhood that went into that. So I think that there is this other feature. Yeah, there's a need to kind of dive into any worthwhile venture. And when you dive in, initially you're overwhelmed by the things that you're presented with, and you are dramatically sort of you find yourself dramatically constrained. So thinking about like a PhD program or any course of study, I mean, your options are drastically reduced.
Yeah.
The only choice at that point is like, am I going to continue or drop out? But then when you get through it, and you find yourself on the other end, obviously there's all of the sort of the positive things that come from having have achieved your goal and being rewarded for it, and receiving your degree and getting the accolades and the respect and all that kind of stuff. But initially, you weren't looking for the PhD for those reasons. You were pursuing it for another set of reasons, and I think that's worth keeping in mind when it comes to mastery. Something about it has to sort of allure you.
And it is working with material and having to learn from masters in many, that's a lot of what especially our fields,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, even though I described it as a union card, the fact of the matter is that I'm sure this is equally true of Tom, you're changed by the material.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The material shapes you, your methodologies, the way you study and things like that shape you. As much as you master as much as you can of the material as well. It's interesting. There was a British writer wrote thrillers, which I read when I was in grad school as a way of sort of getting away from the academic stuff. His name was Anthony Price, and he wrote a long series of books that revolved around a guy named Audley. Audley was a historian, but his job was working for British intelligence.
Yeah. Okay.
Because historians make good analysts. It's what we do. And the thing that was interesting about this, the thing that I was so impressed with Price, is although Audley was a character that sort of held the whole thing together, there was a staple of other characters, and frequently you would get stories from the perspective of other people. And what was really interesting about them is the structure of their mind and how they thought was distinct for each one of them, which I just find a mind-bogglingly... the amount of creativity it takes to do that and imagination it takes to do that, I think, is really impressive. But the thing that was interesting is that the first book, when they were doing Audley, the historian, When he was going through and solving the problem, I knew what he was doing every step of the way. I understood it absolutely perfectly. I would have done exactly the same thing because he was thinking like a historian.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So do you think Price was an historian, or was he just really good at sort of putting himself into this sort of the mind of an historian?
He did some historical work himself. I don't know exactly what his training was. He did a nonfiction book called The Eyes of the Fleet, which was on the Napoleonic Wars and the navies there, but it was a historical work. So, I mean, he obviously had some training in that. But what was really intriguing was how he could do it from so many different directions in the different novels.
Oh yeah, I think that's one of the that's kind of a feature to the craft of fiction, is you become a student of a wide range of sort of characters, people.
Yeah.
But to have a whole book in essentially a mystery thriller kind of espionage kind of genre, written from one of those other perspectives, you can do it in short term. I could see that, but you've really got to know these people inside out to do that. It's very. I thought it was impressive.
It does show kind of the old classic word where we get disciple, right, as student from this fashioning and forming through walking with intimately, kind of every day watching, practicing, seeing, learning, interacting with. And it's the same with material, whether it's other people you study or other crafts that you're walking with them. I remember from studying the theologian Karl Barth, we can like parts, hate parts, love parts, or hate all of it. That's fine. But one thing Barth was a scholar, like it or not. And one of the things he did when he had just finished his master's, but because he wrote his commentary on Romans, he got thrown a position because of the popular book at a university, a chair funded for Reformation thought. And he said, I don't know Reformation thought. So he goes back to the beginning for, I think it was a good decade. All he does is go back and read the Fathers. He goes back and read Calvin and all of this. And he's got a little intro to his lectures on Calvin where he said, if you haven't been discipled by, sat at the feet, been schooled, then you're not ready to start teaching. And so his point is you can't go your own way. You don't have that freedom until you've walked along with and learned from these people. And again, we can argue whether he learned from them or not, or what he learned from them or not, or whether we like what he learned from them. That's a different thing. But I think he was right in the academic formation that before, you're just as much as a teacher, you have to be being a student. You have to be fashioned and formed. And I think similar with guitar. I mean, when I teach guitar, you are showing people just things that everyone has to go through to learn how to make that instrument do certain things and make certain sounds, right? And they become habits through learning and practicing and mimicking. But there's a whole thing you're connected to, an instrument that does make these sounds, that's structured a certain way, and these forms and these scales and all these things accord with it and allow you a freedom and agency within it that brings out all this beauty, or can be very ugly sounding.
So I think that falls under the category of agency.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
When you talk about autonomy here, you've got a lot of people. When you talk about freedom, you can make the guitar do what you want it to.
Yeah.
That sounds like you're talking about autonomy, but you're really talking about agency.
Yeah, and this is one of the things you'll see. I mean, I think like learning any instrument, if you see someone who plays so freely and beautiful, almost like they can play anything that comes to heart or mind, but realizing how much went into that, and even a raw talent, they've had to put so much into it that to get that out of it and more. And but when they have it, it's as if it looks effortless. It just looks like they are completely in accord with that instrument.
In accord, that's good.
Yeah. And what are you doing? You're producing something through that union, if you will, between you and the instrument, and the ordering of it, and the way it the way you relate to it. It is stunning when you think about that's pretty much everything we interact with and do has some sort of dimensions that we have to accord with.
Yeah. I was picking up on the use of the word cord there, by the way.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Anyway, well, we're just about at the top of the hour, and at least by our screens, we seem to have lost Chris.
Yeah.
So maybe this would be a good time to wrap it up. I think we touched on a lot of different things, and this distinction between autonomy and agency has got a lot of parallels and a lot of connections to other fields, which I think it's a really useful and fruitful pair of ideas here. So
yeah, I agree, and I think, like you said, it can spill right over into the social and the ethical at a certain point, and how we get a hold of that can have huge impact on our lives.
Yeah. So, well, you are presumably, like I said, I hope Chris manages to make it back on, but you've gotten to the end of an hour, and so I suppose we need to do our Patreon thing here. If you're enjoying the podcast, we'd like to ask you to consider to support us on Patreon. We don't get any salary for doing this. Nobody pays us, but we do have expenses to put on the show. We've got to have people producing it and all kinds of other things. So if you like what you're hearing, and if it's valuable to you, if you're able to, we would really appreciate the support through Patreon. And with that, I think we will call this a wrap. Yeah. So thank you very much for listening.
Enjoyed it much.
Goodbye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.